Everyone in the Riverside County Courthouse knew when Maverick was in the building. Not because he announced himself, not because he barked or pulled at his leash or demanded attention the way most creatures do when they want to be noticed. It was something quieter than that, something that moved through the hallways ahead of him like a change in the weather. Guards at the security checkpoint would look up from their screens for no reason they could name and find him already there. Dark eyes calm, tail low and easy, paws hitting the marble floor with a soft and steady rhythm that somehow made the whole building feel less like a place where people came to fight and more like a place where things might actually be okay. Maverick was 4 years old, a Belgian Malinois with a coat the color of a California autumn, deep amber fatting into black at his ears and muzzle. He was lean and alert in the way that working dogs always are, carrying in every muscle the particular tension of an animal that is always paying attention. But where other working dogs of his breed radiated intensity, Maverick radiated something rarer. He radiated stillness. And in a building that ran on urgency, on deadlines and objections and the grinding machinery of justice, that stillness was more powerful than anything else he could have offered. He had come to the Riverside County District Attorney's office through a facility dog program that placed specially trained animals in courthouses, hospitals, and advocacy centers across California. The program was not new. Facility dogs had been working in legal settings across the United States for over a decade, helping child witnesses, crime victims, and traumatized individuals navigate systems that were never really designed with their emotional survival in mind. But Maverick, according to everyone who worked with him, was something beyond even what the program had promised. His trainer, a veteran animal behaviorist from San Diego who had placed dozens of dogs in professional settings, said she had never certified an animal quite like him. He seemed to understand, she told Sandra once, not just what he was trained to do, but why. Sandra Flores had been a deputy victim advocate for 11 years when Maverick became her partner. She was a compact, quietly fierce woman in her late 30s who had spent more than a decade sitting beside people on the worst days of their lives, in hospital rooms, police stations, courtrooms, and parking lots at 2 in the morning when there was nowhere else to go. She was good at her job in the way that people are good at things they were built for. But even Sandra, with all her experience and all her hard-won emotional armor, had not been prepared for what it felt like to watch Maverick work. The first time she really saw it, was 6 months after they were partnered together. A teenage boy named Marcus, 17 years old and the survivor of a violent home invasion, had been brought to the courthouse to review his statement before trial. He had walked in looking like someone bracing for a physical blow, shoulders up, jaw tight, eyes fixed on the middle distance in the particular way of people who have learned to be ready for pain at any moment. Sandra had introduced Maverick quietly without expectation. Maverick had walked over to Marcus, sniffed his hand once, and then turned around and sat down directly against the boy's legs, pressing his warm weight into him like a living anchor. Marcus had looked down at the dog. Then his shoulders dropped, not slowly, all at once like something had been cut loose. He pressed his hand into Maverick's fur and started talking, and didn't stop for 40 minutes. Sandra had gone home that night and sat in her car in the driveway for a long time, thinking about what she had watched happen in that room. After that, she stopped trying to understand it and started trusting it completely. Maverick's days were not glamorous by any conventional measure. He arrived at the courthouse each morning in Sandra's silver SUV, rode the elevator to the 3rd floor with his tail wagging exactly twice. Once when the doors opened, once when he spotted the receptionist who always saved him a piece of her morning muffin, and then settled into the rhythm of the day. Some mornings that meant sitting in a waiting room beside an elderly woman who had been defrauded out of her life savings and needed someone to sit with while the lawyers talked in rooms she wasn't allowed to enter. Some afternoons it meant lying quietly at the feet of a domestic violence survivor during a deposition, close enough to touch, far enough not to crowd. Some days nothing dramatic happened at all. He simply existed in spaces where people were afraid, and made those spaces feel marginally less terrifying. That, Sandra would tell anyone who asked, was not a small thing. That was everything. What Maverick had, and what no amount of legal training, procedural protocol, or professional compassion could fully replicate, was an absence of judgment so complete it felt almost supernatural. He did not care what a person had done or not done, what they looked like, how they smelled, whether they were guilty or innocent, strong or broken, eloquent or silent. He came to each person the same way, fully, quietly, and without condition. In a system that was built on evaluation and assessment and the constant measuring of credibility, Maverick offered something that system could never offer on its own. He offered acceptance that asked for absolutely nothing in return. The attorneys knew it. The judges knew it. Even the defense lawyers, who had every professional reason to be skeptical, had been seen pausing in hallways when Maverick passed, watching him go with expressions that were hard to name but impossible to miss. He was, in every sense that mattered, the most important figure in that courthouse. And on a Tuesday morning in October, a 3-year-old girl named Isla was about to find out why. She arrived at the courthouse at 8:47 in the morning, and the world had no idea what it was looking at. To the security guard who waved her through the side entrance, she was just another small child being shepherded through a building that was far too large and far too loud for someone her size. To the clerk who glanced up from her desk as Isla passed through the third-floor hallway, she was simply a quiet little girl in an oversized pink jacket, holding a stuffed rabbit with one eye missing and walking very carefully, like the floor might give way beneath her at any moment. To the case file sitting in the prosecutor's office with her name printed across the top in standard legal font, she was a witness, a key witness, perhaps the most important witness in a child endangerment case that had been building for 7 months and now sat on the edge of collapsing entirely. But to Sandra Flores, who watched Isla walk down that hallway from a distance before introducing herself, she was something else entirely. She was a little girl who had already used up more courage than most people summon in a lifetime, just by continuing to exist in a world that had shown her, very early and very clearly, exactly how cruel it could be. Isla was 3 years old. She would turn 4 in February. She had been removed from her home 5 months earlier under circumstances that the case file described in the careful, bloodless language of legal documentation, but that Sandra, who had read enough of these files to translate them fluently, understood as something far simpler and far more devastating. She had not been safe, and nobody had protected her until it was almost too late. She was now living with a foster family, the Garcias, a warm and patient couple in the San Bernardino area who had opened their home to 11 foster children over the years and who spoke about Isla with a particular kind of tenderness, reserved for children who have been deeply hurt. Maria Garcia, Isla's foster mother, had accompanied her to the courthouse that morning. She sat beside Isla in the waiting room with her hands folded in her lap, and her face arranged into an expression of careful calm that Sandra recognized immediately. The expression of someone working very hard not to show how worried they actually were. Maria had told Sandra during their pre-visit call that Isla had been doing better. She ate well. She slept through most nights now. She had started watching cartoons in the morning and sometimes laughed at them, which Maria said she wrote down in a little notebook she kept because she wanted to remember every first. But talking, real talking, the kind that required Isla to open a door inside herself that she had locked for very good reasons, that was still a mountain nobody had been able to climb. The professionals who had worked with Isla read like a roster of the most qualified child trauma specialists in Southern California. Dr. Patricia Wynn, a child psychologist with 23 years of experience working exclusively with abuse survivors, had conducted 4 sessions with Isla over the past 2 months. Her notes were thorough and deeply sympathetic, but her conclusion was honest and stark. Isla presented with severe trauma-related selective mutism and was, at this time, unable to engage verbally in clinical settings with unfamiliar adults. A forensic interviewer trained specifically in the NICHD protocol, the gold standard for interviewing child witnesses, had attempted a structured session with Isla in a child-friendly room designed down to its paint color and furniture height to feel as safe as possible. Isla had sat through the entire session without speaking a single word. Not one. She had looked at the interviewer with those enormous, careful eyes and said absolutely nothing for 45 minutes. The interviewer, a woman who had successfully conducted over 300 forensic interviews with traumatized children, had walked out of the room and told the lead prosecutor quietly that she didn't know what else to try. The lead prosecutor, Assistant District Attorney David Chen, was a measured and experienced attorney who had built his career on staying composed under pressure. But the morning Isla arrived at the courthouse, Sandra caught him standing alone in the hallway outside the waiting room, staring at the wall with his hands in his pockets and the particular expression of a man who is doing math that isn't adding up. The case against the defendant was strong in several areas. But the element that Isla could confirm, the thing that only she had witnessed, only she could speak to, was a piece the prosecution needed badly. Without it, Chen had told his team privately, the defense had enough room to maneuver, and a 3-year-old girl who wouldn't speak was a door he had no key for. Inside the waiting room, Isla sat in a chair that was slightly too tall for her, so her feet dangled above the floor and swung very slightly, the way small children's feet do when they're trying to hold very still, but their bodies won't completely cooperate. She had her stuffed rabbit pressed against her chest with both arms. She was looking at the floor. Not at the carpet pattern, not at anything specific, just down, in the way of someone who has learned that looking up too often means making eye contact, and making eye contact means being asked things, and being asked things means a world of complicated pain she had no tools left to navigate. Maria Garcia rubbed slow circles on Isla's back and said nothing, because she had learned over 5 months that words, however kind, were not what Isla needed. What Isla needed was something Maria could feel but not name, something she had prayed about on the drive to the courthouse that morning with the radio off and Isla asleep in the back seat. Sandra stood in the doorway and watched the little girl for a long moment. She had seen this before, this particular kind of silence, this particular kind of stillness that wasn't peace, it was armor. And she had learned in 11 years of this work that armor this thick had been built for a reason, and that forcing it open never worked. You couldn't argue a traumatized child back into language. You couldn't schedule it or protocol it or will it into existence with the best intentions in the world. But sometimes, not always, not on command, but sometimes, something unexpected could slip through the gap. Sandra turned away from the doorway, walked down the hall, and picked up Maverick's leash. Sandra Flores had learned something important in 11 years of victim advocacy work. And it was this: the moments that actually change things almost never look the way you expect them to. They don't arrive with fanfare or formal announcements. They don't follow the careful scripts that professionals spend weeks preparing. They don't happen in the structured sessions or the specially designed rooms or the carefully orchestrated environments that cost thousands of dollars and hundreds of hours to put together. They happen in the margins, in the unplanned spaces between the official attempts, in the quiet moments when everyone has stopped performing and something real is finally allowed to breathe. Sandra had stopped performing a long time ago, and as she walked down the third-floor hallway toward the room where Maverick waited with his morning handler, she wasn't following a protocol. She wasn't executing a strategy. She was following something older and less articulable than either of those things, a feeling that lived somewhere between instinct and experience and had never once, in 11 years, steered her completely wrong. Maverick was sitting near the window at the end of the hall when she reached him, watching the parking lot below with the focused but unhurried attention of a dog who finds everything mildly interesting and nothing particularly alarming. He looked up when Sandra approached, and his tail moved in that slow, deliberate way of his, not the frantic wagging of a dog seeking approval, but the calm, measured greeting of an animal that is genuinely glad to see someone and sees no reason to be dramatic about it. Sandra clipped his leash, crouched down for a moment and looked at him. "Okay," she said quietly. "Let's go see if you can do something the rest of us can't." Maverick stood, shook himself once from nose to tail the way dogs do when they're transitioning from one state of being to another, and fell into step beside her. They didn't rush. Sandra had learned never to rush Maverick into a room. Part of what made him extraordinary was the way he arrived, which was always at his own pace and on his own terms, without the anxious energy that humans so often carried into spaces where anxious energy was the last thing anyone needed. They walked the length of the hallway slowly, Sandra's heels quiet on the marble, Maverick's paws making the soft, rhythmic sound that courthouse staff had learned to recognize the way sailors learn to recognize the sound of a favorable wind. When they reached the waiting room door, Sandra paused with her hand on the handle. Through the small rectangular window in the door she could see the room clearly. Maria Garcia sat in the same position she had been in 20 minutes ago, back straight, hands folded, doing the hard and invisible work of being steady for a child who needed steadiness more than anything else in the world. And Isla was exactly where Sandra had left her, feet dangling, rabbit clutched to her chest, eyes fixed on the floor with the concentrated focus of someone who has decided that if they look down hard enough, the rest of the world might simply stop existing. Sandra took a breath, then she opened the door. She didn't walk in first. She stepped to the side of the doorway and simply let Maverick lead, which was not a trained behavior but something he seemed to understand instinctively, the way he seemed to understand so many things that nobody had explicitly taught him. He crossed the threshold at an easy, unhurried walk, his nails making the gentlest sound against the transition strip between the hallway tile and the waiting room carpet, and then he was inside. He stopped just past the doorway and did what he always did in new rooms. He took a moment. He raised his nose slightly and read the air the way dogs do, cataloging everything the room contained. The smell of Maria's hand lotion, the particular scent of institutional carpet cleaner, the faint trace of the juice box Isla had drunk an hour ago and barely touched, and beneath all of it, unmistakable to an animal built to sense such things, the sharp and specific scent of fear. Not danger. Not threat. Just fear, the quiet, chronic, exhausting kind that lives in a body for so long it starts to feel like a permanent resident. Maverick processed all of this in approximately 4 seconds. Then he walked to the center of the room, turned once in a small, unhurried circle, lowered himself to the carpet and lay down. He put his head on his paws. He let out a single, slow breath that seemed to come from somewhere very deep. And then he was still completely, utterly still in the particular way that large, calm dogs are still, which is not the stillness of absence but the stillness of presence, of something solid and warm and entirely without agenda, occupying space in a room and asking absolutely nothing of anyone in it. Sandra stepped inside and moved quietly to the chair nearest the door. She picked up the clipboard she had left on the side table and looked at it without seeing it, because every atom of her attention was on Isla. Maria Garcia had gone very still as well. She had stopped the slow circles on Isla's back. She understood, with the intuition of a woman who had mothered many frightened children, that this was a moment that required everyone to do less, not more. For several long seconds, nothing happened. Isla continued staring at the floor. Maverick continued lying on the carpet. The room held everything it contained, the fear, the hope, the weight of a case that hung in the air like something physical and did not exhale. And then, in the way that the most important moments always arrive, it happened without announcement. Isla stopped staring at the floor. It wasn't a dramatic movement. She didn't gasp or sit up straight or turn her head with any kind of suddenness. It was slower than that and more profound, a gradual lifting, like something underground turning toward light. Her chin rose by degrees. Her eyes traveled up from the carpet, across the room, and found Maverick. And they stayed there. She looked at him the way children look at things that feel genuinely safe, with her whole face open, every guard temporarily forgotten, as if the carefully constructed walls she had built around herself had developed, without her permission, a window. She studied him with an intensity that was almost reverent. The way he was lying, the way his chest rose and fell, the way his eyes, half closed and warm, seemed to be looking at nothing and everything at the same time. Maverick did not look back at her directly. He gazed at the middle distance in the way of dogs who have learned that direct eye contact can feel like pressure, and pressure is the last thing a frightened creature needs. But his ear, the left one, the one closest to Isla, tilted almost imperceptibly in her direction, tracking her, aware of her, present with her in a way that required no eye contact to communicate. Sandra watched this exchange from her chair by the door and felt the particular sensation she had learned to recognize over years of this work, the feeling of a room changing, not dramatically, not all at once, but changing, the way the air changes before rain, in a way that you can feel before you can name. Maria Garcia felt it too. Sandra could see it in the way the older woman's shoulders dropped half an inch, just half an inch, from where they had been held tight with worry all morning. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. Nobody did anything at all except breathe and wait and trust, in the fragile and enormous way that people trust things they cannot control, that whatever was beginning in this room would be allowed to continue. Maverick exhaled again, slow, warm, completely unhurried. And across the room, a little girl with a one-eyed rabbit pressed against her chest leaned forward, just barely, just a fraction, toward the dog lying on the carpet in the middle of the floor. It was the smallest movement in the world. It was the beginning of everything. There is a particular kind of silence that exists in rooms where something important is about to happen. It is not the silence of emptiness. It is not the silence of absence or neglect or the simple quiet of a place where nothing is occurring. It is a charged and living silence, the kind that has weight and texture and a pulse of its own, the kind that experienced people learn to recognize and, more importantly, learn not to disturb. Sandra Flores had sat inside that kind of silence dozens of times over 11 years of this work. She knew its shape. She knew what it asked of the people inside it. It asked them to do the hardest thing that human beings, especially professional human beings with training and protocols, and the urgent weight of outcomes pressing down on them, almost never manage to do. It asked them to wait, to do nothing, to want nothing, to need nothing from the moment except to let it be exactly what it was, without reaching into it and trying to shape it into something more useful. Sandra waited. Maria Garcia waited, her hands now resting quietly in her lap, her eyes soft and carefully unfocused in the way of a woman who understood that watching too intently was its own kind of pressure. Maverick waited most naturally of all, because waiting was something he had never needed to learn. It was simply part of what he was, a creature for whom the present moment was not a place to pass through on the way to somewhere more important, but the only place that had ever existed or ever would. And Isla was no longer looking at the floor. She had been staring at Maverick for what Sandra estimated was close to 3 full minutes, which is an eternity in the life of a moment like this one. And in that time, her entire body had undergone a transformation so gradual it was almost invisible, and yet so complete it was impossible to miss. The rigid set of her small shoulders had softened. The white-knuckled grip on her stuffed rabbit had loosened, not released, but loosened, so that the rabbit now rested against her chest with less desperation and more comfort. Her feet, which had been swinging with that restless, anxious energy of a child holding herself very still, had gone quiet. She sat with her sneakers dangling above the carpet, and her whole face turned toward the dog in the center of the room like a small planet that had found, unexpectedly, a new source of gravity. She was leaning forward. Not dramatically, not in any way that would have been visible from a distance or captured clearly in the grainy security footage that would later be reviewed by people who were trying to understand what had happened in this room, But Sandra could see it. Maria could see it. That barely their tilt of a child's body toward something that felt, for the first time in longer than she could articulate, safe. Then Isla moved. She didn't announce it. She didn't look at Maria for permission or at Sandra for reassurance. She simply decided, in the private and sovereign way that small children make their most important decisions, entirely from the inside out, that she was going to get closer. She placed her free hand on the edge of the chair. She slid forward until her sneakers found the carpet. She stood up. And she walked toward Maverick. 3 steps. That was all it was. 3 small steps across a waiting room carpet that probably spanned no more than 4 feet of physical distance. But Sandra Flores, watching from her chair by the door, felt those 3 steps the way you feel the first tremor of something enormous shifting beneath the surface of the earth. Not with your ears or your eyes, but somewhere deeper. Somewhere that exists below the reach of professional training and clinical language and the careful management of expectations. Isla stopped when she was close enough to reach him. She stood there for a moment, this tiny girl in her oversized pink jacket with her one-eyed rabbit and her carefully constructed walls and her 3 years of a life that had already asked too much of her. And she looked down at Maverick with an expression that Sandra would later struggle to describe to colleagues who asked her what it had been like to be in that room. The closest she ever got was this. It looked like recognition. Not the recognition of having met someone before. The deeper kind. The kind that happens when something outside of you reflects something inside of you so accurately that, for a moment, the boundary between the two becomes unclear. Isla crouched down. She brought herself to Maverick's level with the natural, unself-conscious ease of a child who has not yet learned to be awkward in her body, folding herself down until she and the dog were face to face, her dark eyes level with his amber ones, her small face inches from his broad, calm muzzle. She studied him with the complete and total attention that children give to things that matter to them, taking in every detail. The way his ears sat relaxed against his head, the slow rise and fall of his ribs, the tiny movements of his nose as it continued its quiet work of reading the world around him. Maverick held completely still. He didn't lean toward her. He didn't pull back. He simply remained present and warm and utterly without agenda and let her look. And then Isla spoke. It came out as barely a sound, less than a whisper, more like the idea of a whisper, a breath that had been shaped, almost accidentally, into 2 small words by a voice that had forgotten, somewhere in the dark months behind her, what it felt like to use itself. Hi, doggy. 2 words. In the architecture of this case, with its hundreds of pages of legal documentation, its months of professional effort, its roster of expert witnesses and forensic interviews and carefully constructed arguments, 2 words should not have been able to fill a room the way these 2 words filled this one. But they did. They expanded into every corner of that small waiting room and pressed against the walls and changed the air and made Sandra set down her clipboard very carefully on her knee, because she didn't trust her hands to hold it steadily anymore. Maverick's tail moved. Once, slow and low and deliberate, a single sweep across the carpet that said, in the language he had been speaking his entire life, everything that needed to be said. Isla watched it happen, and something in her face shifted, a loosening around the eyes, a softening at the corners of her mouth that wasn't quite a smile but was the country that smiles are made from. She reached out her hand. She placed it on top of Maverick's head, her small fingers pressing gently into the fur between his ears, and she held it there. Maverick closed his eyes for a moment, just a moment in the way of dogs who are receiving something they find deeply good, and then opened them again, warm and steady and fixed softly on the middle distance. Isla kept her hand in his fur. She was quiet for a moment that stretched and stretched, elastic with everything it contained. Sandra did not move. Maria did not move. The courthouse continued its business beyond the walls of this small room. Phones rang, doors opened and closed. the machinery of justice ground forward on its usual axis, and none of it touched what was happening here. Then Isla spoke again. 5 words. 5 small, quiet, earth-shifting words that came out of her in a voice slightly stronger than the first 2, still a whisper, still fragile, still carrying in every syllable the weight of everything she had been through, but real, present, unmistakably, irrevocably hers. Are you scared too? Sandra stopped breathing. She would think about those 5 words for the rest of her career. She would turn them over in her mind during long drives and quiet evenings, and the particular 3 in the morning wakefulness that comes to people who do this kind of work and carry it home in ways they can never fully explain. She would think about what it meant that a 3-year-old girl, in the first moment of genuine connection she had allowed herself in months, had not said something about the dog's fur or his size or his eyes or any of the observable physical things that children typically notice first. She had asked if he was scared. Because she was scared, and she needed, more than she needed anything else in that moment, to know that she was not scared alone. Maverick turned his head. Slowly, with the deliberate and gentle care of an animal who understood, in whatever way animals understand the things that matter most, that this moment required his fullest presence, he turned his face toward Isla. His amber eyes found hers. He held her gaze for a long, still moment, and then he exhaled a long, slow, warm breath that moved the fine hair at her temple and seemed to carry in it every bit of the answer she had needed. Isla leaned forward and pressed her forehead very gently against the side of his face. Maverick did not move. He held her there, this broken and brave and extraordinary little girl, with nothing but his stillness and his warmth and the simple, radical act of remaining completely present. And in that moment, in that small waiting room in a California courthouse on a Tuesday morning in October, something that had been locked for a very long time began, at last, to open. Sandra Flores turned toward the window. She gave Isla the privacy of the moment. And she let herself, just briefly, just in the 2 or 3 seconds before she put her professional composure back in place like a coat against the cold, feel the full and staggering weight of what she had just witnessed. Sandra Flores had filed a lot of unusual requests in 11 years of victim advocacy work. She had requested that testimony be taken in hospital rooms when witnesses were too injured to travel. She had requested that court proceedings be paused while a survivor regained enough composure to continue. She had requested modified lighting, rearranged furniture, alternative seating configurations, and on one memorable occasion, a different building entirely because the original courthouse location was too close to the place where a crime had occurred, and the proximity alone was enough to destabilize the witness beyond the point of function. She had made requests that made clerks raise their eyebrows and attorneys exhale slowly through their noses and judges look up from their paperwork with expressions that said, clearly and without words, that this was going to require some convincing. She had never been afraid to make the request anyway. But as she sat down at the small desk in her 3rd-floor office 20 minutes after leaving Isla and Maverick together in the waiting room, Isla now cross-legged on the carpet, her rabbit set aside for the first time all morning, both hands buried in Maverick's fur while she spoke to him in a voice too quiet to hear clearly but unmistakably real. Sandra stared at the blank email on her screen and understood that what she was about to ask for was different from anything she had asked for before. She was about to ask Judge Patricia Harmon to allow a dog into her courtroom. Not into a waiting room, not into a hallway or a victim's lounge or any of the peripheral spaces where facility animals had become, over the past decade, a reasonably accepted presence in the California court system. Into the courtroom itself, into the actual chamber of legal proceedings, where a child witness would be asked to provide testimony that could determine the outcome of a serious criminal case. Into the most formal, most scrutinized, most procedurally rigid space in the entire building. Sandra typed the request carefully. She cited California Penal Code Section 868.4, which permitted the use of support persons, and by established legal extension in several precedent cases, certified facility animals during the testimony of vulnerable witnesses. She attached Isla's psychological evaluation from Dr. Patricia Wynn. She attached the forensic interview report documenting the failed structured session. She attached Maverick's certification records, his training documentation, his placement history, and a summary of the research literature on the neurological impact of animal-assisted intervention on trauma-induced selective mutism in young children. She wrote clearly and without embellishment, because she knew that Judge Harmon did not respond to embellishment. She responded to facts, precedent, and the precise application of law. Sandra read the request through twice, made 3 small edits, and sent it. Then she walked to the window and looked at the parking lot below and waited for the world to respond. Judge Patricia Harmon had been on the bench for 31 years. She had presided over cases that had made regional headlines and cases that had broken her heart quietly and privately in ways she never discussed with anyone. She had sentenced people to decades in prison and watched defendants weep with relief at acquittals and maintained, through all of it, the particular judicial composure that is less about the absence of feeling and more about the disciplined management of it. The understanding that a courtroom requires a steady hand at its center, regardless of what storms are moving through it. She was not known for being warm. She was known for being fair, which is a different thing entirely and, in the long accounting of a legal career, considerably more valuable. Attorneys who appeared before her prepared meticulously because she noticed everything and forgave nothing that could have been avoided with proper preparation. She ran her courtroom on a set of principles so consistent they had become, over 3 decades, almost gravitational, immovable forces that shaped the behavior of everyone who entered her jurisdiction. She was also, though very few people in the courthouse knew it, the owner of a 12-year-old golden retriever named Biscuit who slept at the foot of her bed every night, and who she credited, in the privacy of her own thoughts, with having gotten her through the hardest years of her career with her sanity reasonably intact. She read Sandra's request 3 times. The first time she read it as a judge, scanning for legal foundation, precedent applicability, procedural soundness. The second time she read it as an administrator, considering the practical implications for her courtroom, the management of the physical space, the impact on proceedings. The third time she read it as something she rarely allowed herself to be inside these walls. She read it as a human being. She set the papers down on her desk and sat quietly for a moment. Through the tall windows of her chambers, she could see the palm trees that lined the courthouse approach, moving slightly in the October wind. She thought about the psychological evaluation. She thought about the forensic interview, 45 minutes of silence from a 3-year-old girl who had more reason to be silent than any child should ever have. She thought about what it meant to ask a child that young to walk into a formal legal proceeding and perform the almost impossible act of converting the worst experience of her life into language that a courtroom could use. Then she picked up her phone and asked her clerk to schedule a hearing on the request for that afternoon. The defense team's response arrived within the hour, and it was exactly what Sandra had anticipated. Lead defense attorney Richard Paulson was a tall, silver-haired man in his late 50s who had built a 30-year career on the precise and aggressive protection of his client's constitutional rights, which was a legitimate and important function of the legal system that Sandra respected entirely in the abstract and found profoundly inconvenient in practice. His written objection to Sandra's request was thorough, pointed, and made 3 distinct arguments that were each, Sandra had to admit, not entirely without merit. The first was prejudice. A dog in the courtroom, Paulson argued, would generate an emotional response in the jury that was entirely independent of the evidence, a sympathetic reaction to an animal that would transfer, irrationally but inevitably, to the witness beside it, and color the jury's perception of her testimony in ways that could not be corrected by instruction. The second was distraction. A live animal in a legal proceeding introduced an unpredictable variable that could disrupt the orderly conduct of the hearing at any moment. The third was precedent, specifically, that granting this request would establish a standard that could be exploited in future cases in ways that extended far beyond the legitimate therapeutic purpose being cited here. He requested that the motion be denied in full. The hearing that afternoon lasted 40 minutes. Sandra presented her case with the focused, evidence-based precision of someone who had anticipated every objection and prepared for each one specifically. She walked Judge Harmon through the California Penal Code provisions. She referenced 3 precedent cases from other California jurisdictions in which facility dogs had been permitted in courtrooms during child testimony, and in which those decisions had subsequently survived appellate review. She summarized the psychological literature on trauma-induced mutism and the documented therapeutic mechanism by which animal presence enabled verbal communication in cases where conventional intervention had failed. And then she said something that was not in her prepared notes, something that came from the 11 years and from the waiting room that morning, and from the image she could not stop seeing of a 3-year-old girl pressing her forehead against a dog's face and asking him if he was scared too. She said, "Your Honor, we have exhausted every conventional option available to us. This child has been failed by every standard intervention this system offers. What happened this morning in that waiting room is the first time in months that Isla has communicated with anything or anyone. We are not asking for special treatment. We are asking for the minimum accommodation necessary to give a vulnerable child a fighting chance at being heard." The room was quiet when she finished. Judge Harmon looked at her for a long moment over the top of her reading glasses. Then she looked at Richard Paulson, who made his objections clearly and professionally, and with the practiced confidence of a man who believed he was right. Judge Harmon listened to all of it. She made no notes. She asked 2 clarifying questions, one about Maverick's specific training certification and one about the physical arrangement that would be used in the courtroom. Sandra answered both precisely. Then Judge Harmon picked up her pen. She signed the approval. She set the pen down and looked at both sides of the room with the steady, unambiguous authority of a woman who had made her decision and would not be revisiting it. "The child's capacity to testify is the paramount concern of this court," she said. "The request is granted under the following conditions." She listed them clearly. Maverick would remain beside Isla at all times. He would be under the direct control of his handler at all moments. Any disruption attributable to his presence would result in immediate removal. The jury would be instructed specifically that the presence of the animal was a procedural accommodation and should not be considered as evidence or allowed to influence their assessment of witness credibility. She closed the folder on her desk. "We proceed tomorrow morning," she said, 9 o'clock. And with that, for the first time in the history of Judge Patricia Harmon's courtroom, a dog had been given permission to walk through its doors. The morning of the hearing arrived the way important mornings always do, quietly, without ceremony, indifferent to the weight of what it carried. The sun came up over Riverside County the same way it always did, burning off the thin October mist that settled over the valley overnight and filling the courthouse parking lot with the particular flat golden light of a California autumn morning. Cars pulled in. Attorneys walked from their vehicles with coffee cups and leather briefcases. Security staff took their positions. The building opened its doors and swallowed the day whole, the way it did every morning, mechanical and unhurried and completely unaware that something was about to happen inside its walls that none of the people who worked there would forget for a very long time. Sandra Flores had arrived 40 minutes early. She had not slept well, not because she was afraid the hearing would go badly. She had done everything within her power to prepare for it, and she had learned long ago that losing sleep over things beyond her control was a form of suffering that helped no one, least of all the people she was trying to help. She had not slept well because she kept seeing Isla's face. The face from the waiting room yesterday, open and unguarded, and turned toward Maverick with that expression that Sandra still could not find adequate words for. She kept thinking about what it had cost that little girl to take those 3 steps across the carpet. And she kept thinking about what it was going to cost her to walk through those courtroom doors. She had gone to collect Maverick from the overnight facility at 6:15 in the morning, and he had greeted her the way he always did, with that single, slow tail wag and the calm, attentive eyes of an animal that wakes up already present, already ready, without the fog of anxiety or anticipation that clouds the mornings of the humans around him. She had checked his coat, checked his temperament, walked him twice around the parking lot to let him settle into the day. He had been, as always, exactly what he always was, steady, warm, complete. She had brought him to the small preparation room adjacent to the courthouse entrance at 7:30 and sat with him on the floor while she reviewed her notes, his warm weight pressed against her leg, and thought about the hours ahead. Isla arrived at 8:15 with Maria Garcia. She was wearing the same pink jacket as the day before. Maria had told Sandra quietly over the phone that morning that Isla had insisted on it, had pointed to it in the closet with unusual certainty, as if she had decided overnight that it was the thing she needed to be wearing for whatever this day was going to ask of her. Her hair had been brushed and gathered into 2 small pigtails that Maria had clearly taken care with. She was holding her rabbit. She was quiet. But Sandra noticed, and the noticing made something tighten in her chest in a way that was not quite sadness and not quite joy, but lived in the complicated territory between them, that Isla was not staring at the floor. She was looking around, not with the wide, overwhelmed eyes of a child confronting a frightening new environment, with something more specific than that, something more purposeful. She was looking for something. Sandra understood what it was before Isla's eyes found her in the corridor. Isla looked past Sandra. She was looking for Maverick. Sandra brought him around the corner from the preparation room, and the moment Isla saw him, her whole body changed in the way that Sandra had already learned to watch for that subtle, total shift from braced to open, from defended to present, that Maverick seemed to produce and frighten people simply by existing in their line of sight. Isla walked to him without being asked. She put her hand on his head. She didn't say anything out loud, but her lips moved, the smallest private communication, offered downward to the top of a dog's head, that Sandra deliberately did not try to read. Maverick leaned slightly into her hand. Sandra placed the leash loop carefully into Isla's palm and folded the small fingers around it. She met Maria's eyes over the top of Isla's head. Maria nodded once, a small, composed nod that contained, Sandra knew, a very large amount of everything that could not be said in a courthouse hallway at 8:20 in the morning. They walked toward the courtroom together. The room was already occupied when the doors opened. Assistant District Attorney David Chen was at the prosecution table, his case files arranged with the precise organization of a man who controls what he can because so much in this work cannot be controlled. He looked up when Sandra entered, and his eyes went immediately to Isla, taking in the efficient way of experienced attorneys, everything that mattered. The lifted chin, the hand wrapped around the leash, the fact that she was walking forward instead of being guided. Something in his expression shifted, not dramatically, not in any way that would have been visible from the gallery, but Sandra caught it. The particular loosening of a face that has been holding itself in tension for a very long time. Richard Paulson was at the defense table with 2 members of his team. He did not look up when Sandra entered. He was reviewing documents with the focused concentration of a man who had made his objections, lost them, and recalibrated entirely toward the question of how to manage the situation he now found himself in. Sandra respected that. It was, in its way, a form of professionalism. The jury was not yet present. They would be brought in after Isla was situated, another condition of Judge Harmon's approval, designed to allow the child to settle into the space before the additional pressure of 12 watching strangers was introduced. The gallery held a small number of approved observers, a victim's rights advocate, 2 members of the prosecution support team, and a single court-approved journalist whose presence had been negotiated carefully, and who had agreed to strict conditions around what could and could not be reported regarding the child's identity and testimony. The room was quiet in the specific way that courtrooms are quiet before proceedings begin, not empty quiet, but loaded quiet, the silence of a space that knows what it is about to contain and is holding itself in preparation. Sandra led Isla to the specially arranged witness area, a child-sized chair that had been brought in specifically for this hearing, positioned at a slight angle that allowed Isla to see the child advocate who would be asking the questions without having to face the full breadth of the room. Beside the chair, a low platform had been placed on the floor, a small elevated surface that Maverick could lie on that would bring him level with Isla's hand without requiring her to reach down awkwardly. Maverick stepped onto the platform without instruction. He turned once, lowered himself, and settled his head resting at the exact height of Isla's knee, warm and solid and completely still. Isla looked down at him. She placed her free hand on his back, and then she looked up at the room, at the high ceilings and the formal wood paneling and the flags standing at attention in their holders and all the grave, adult apparatus of justice arranged around her small body, and she did not look away. Sandra took her position to the side, close enough to intervene if needed, far enough to give Isla the psychological space of independence. The bailiff opened the side door. "All rise," he said. Judge Patricia Harmon entered her courtroom. She took her seat, looked out over the room with the calm authority of 31 years on the bench, and her eyes moved, just briefly, just for a fraction of a second, to the child in the witness chair and the dog at her knee. Something passed across the judge's face in that fraction of a second that was gone before anyone could have named it with certainty. Then her expression returned to its customary judicial composure, and she opened the proceedings. The jury was brought in. And this was the moment. This was the moment the courtroom went still. Because what the 12 members of that jury saw when they filed into their seats and looked toward the witness area was something that none of their collective years of life experience had prepared them for. Not the dog specifically, not the child specifically, but the 2 of them together, the small girl in the pink jacket sitting in the child-sized chair with her chin up and her hand resting on the back of a large, calm dog who lay at her knee like something immovable and ancient, like something that had been placed there by a force considerably larger than courthouse procedure. Juror number 4, a middle school teacher from Morno Valley who would later, in the aftermath of the trial, describe this moment in an interview, said that when she sat down and saw Isla and Maverick, she felt something she could only describe as the sensation of the room taking a breath. Not the people in the room itself. Like the walls and the ceiling and the floor and all the formal gravity of the space had inhaled together and then slowly let it go. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. Even Richard Paulson, who had every professional reason to be unmoved by this tableau, and who had spent the morning constructing the internal architecture of his detachment from it, set down his pen. The child advocate leaned forward in her chair and asked Isla the first question, gently, precisely, in the careful language that had been approved and reviewed and prepared over weeks of expert consultation. Isla looked down at Maverick. Just once, just for a single second. Then she looked up. And she answered. Her voice was small. It was quiet. It shook slightly on the first word and steadied on the second, and by the third it was as clear as anything that had ever been spoken in that room, not because it was loud, but because of what it had cost and what it meant, and the absolute and total silence of every person present who understood, without needing it explained, that they were hearing something that almost hadn't happened. Something that a dog, lying still on a courthouse platform, had made possible. Sandra Flores pressed her thumbnail into her palm and kept her face composed and her eyes dry and her breathing even. She was a professional. She waited until she got to her car that evening to let herself feel the full size of what she had watched happen in that room. It took a while. In the days that followed the hearing, the Riverside County Courthouse returned to its ordinary rhythms the way institutions always do after extraordinary things happen inside them. Efficiently, almost defensively, as if the building itself needed to reassert the primacy of routine over the uncomfortable miracle it had just witnessed. Cases were called. Motions were filed. The elevators ran on their usual schedule, and the coffee cart in the lobby did its usual morning business, and the security guards at the front entrance processed the usual tide of attorneys and witnesses and anxious families who moved through the building every day carrying the full and complicated weight of their particular encounters with the justice system. On the surface, nothing had changed. But beneath the surface, in the offices and corridors and break rooms where the people who worked in that building talked to each other when they weren't performing their professional roles, something was different. Something had shifted in the way that things shift when a community of people witnesses something together that none of them had expected, and none of them can quite stop thinking about. Conversations that began about scheduling or caseloads or parking permits found their way, almost inevitably, to the same place. To a Tuesday morning, to a pink jacket, to a dog lying still on a wooden platform while a 3-year-old girl found her voice. Sandra heard these conversations in pieces, the way you hear music from a neighboring apartment, fragments and impressions rather than the whole. A clerk who stopped her in the hallway to say simply, quietly, that she had heard what happened and that it mattered. A veteran bailiff who had been in that courtroom for 20 years and who passed Sandra one afternoon near the elevators and said nothing at all, just nodded once with an expression that contained more than any available words could have carried. An attorney from a completely unrelated division of the DA's office who knocked on Sandra's door one afternoon and asked if she could meet Maverick. Sandra said yes. She always said yes to that. The legal and psychological communities, however, did not process what had happened in quiet hallway conversations. They processed it the way those communities process significant events, through documentation, analysis, peer consultation, and the careful, rigorous work of extracting from a single remarkable occurrence the generalizable principles that might make other remarkable occurrences possible. Within 2 weeks of the hearing, Sandra had received contact from 3 separate researchers who had heard about the case through professional networks and wanted to discuss it. Within a month, a child trauma center in Los Angeles had reached out to ask if Sandra would be willing to present at their annual symposium. Within 6 weeks, a legal journal had made an inquiry about publishing a case study. Sandra referred them all to the appropriate channels and kept her focus where it had always been, on the people in front of her, not the professional recognition that occasionally accrued from helping them. But there was one conversation she did not redirect or defer. Dr. Angela Reyes was 44 years old, based in San Diego, and widely regarded as one of the most rigorous and intellectually honest forensic child psychologists practicing in California. She had published extensively on trauma-induced communication disorders in young children, had testified as an expert witness in over 150 cases across the state, and had a reputation in professional circles for being constitutionally incapable of overstating her conclusions, a quality that made her work deeply trustworthy and her expert testimony particularly devastating to whatever side she was testifying against. She had heard about Isla's case through a colleague who had been present at the courthouse that week, and she had reached out to Sandra not as a researcher seeking data, but as a professional seeking understanding. They met for coffee at a quiet place near the courthouse on a Thursday afternoon, 3 weeks after the hearing, and talked for 2.5 hours. What Dr. Reyes explained to Sandra that afternoon, patiently, precisely, in the language of someone who has spent a career translating complex neurological phenomena into terms that non-specialists can actually use, was something that Sandra had witnessed dozens of times with Maverick, but had never had the scientific framework to fully articulate. Trauma, Dr. Reyes explained, is not simply a psychological experience. It is a physiological one. When a child or any person experiences severe or prolonged trauma, the nervous system responds by entering a state of chronic hyperarousal, a persistent, body-level alertness to threat that does not distinguish between real danger and the memory of danger, between the original traumatic event and the environments that simply remind the nervous system of it. A courtroom, with its unfamiliar adults and formal procedures and the implicit demand for performance, is precisely the kind of environment that activates this response in traumatized children. And when the nervous system is in that state, flooded with cortisol, locked in the ancient biological circuitry of fight, flight, or freeze, language becomes functionally inaccessible, not metaphorically inaccessible, not inaccessible in the sense of a choice or a reluctance, physiologically, neurologically, literally inaccessible. The parts of the brain responsible for complex verbal communication require a degree of prefrontal cortex activation that is simply not available when the survival response is running the system. The words are not hidden. They are, in the most concrete neurological sense, unreachable. This was what had happened in Isla's forensic interview. This was what had happened in every clinical session, every carefully arranged meeting with every trained professional who had tried to reach her. It was not a failure of technique or effort or compassion. It was a physiological reality that no amount of skill or preparation could overcome through conventional means. What Maverick had done, and what Dr. Reyes described with a precision that Sandra found simultaneously clinical and profound, was intervene at the level of the nervous system itself. The presence of a calm, non-threatening animal, she explained, activates the parasympathetic nervous system, the branch of the autonomic nervous system responsible for the body's rest and regulation response, the biological counterweight to the fight-or-flight state. This activation happens not through cognition or conscious decision, but through sensory experience, the warmth of fur under the hand, the rhythm of a large animal's breathing, the simple felt sense of proximity to a creature that is radiating calm rather than demand. The body responds to these inputs directly, below the level of thought, in the ancient and automatic way that mammals have always responded to cues of safety in their environment. And as the nervous system begins to regulate, as the cortisol levels drop and the prefrontal cortex comes back online, and the survival response loosens its grip on the body's resources, language returns. Not all at once, not completely, but enough. Enough for a 3-year-old girl to slide off a chair and walk 3 steps across a carpet and ask a dog if he was scared too. Enough for that same girl to sit in a formal courtroom, proceeding, and answer questions that the entire apparatus of the California justice system had been unable to unlock through any other means. Dr. Reyes set down her coffee cup and looked at Sandra directly. "What your dog did in that waiting room," she said, "is not magic, it is neuroscience, but I want to be clear about something." She paused. "The fact that it can be explained does not make it any less extraordinary. Understanding the mechanism does not diminish the outcome. That child found her voice. The science tells us how. It does not tell us what that means for her, for the case, for the system that almost failed to make room for it." Sandra thought about that for a long time after she left. The case outcome was significant. The testimony Isla had provided, limited in scope, careful in its boundaries, but clear and consistent, and delivered with the unimpeachable honesty of a child who has no capacity for strategic deception, combined with the existing physical and documentary evidence to build a prosecution case that the defense ultimately could not dismantle. The defendant was convicted on the primary charges. Assistant District Attorney David Chen, in his brief remarks to colleagues after the verdict, was characteristically measured. He talked about the strength of the evidence, the thoroughness of the investigation, the professionalism of his team. He thanked the victim advocates. He thanked the expert witnesses. And then he paused for a moment, in the way of a man choosing his words with particular care, and said that he had been practicing law for 19 years and that he had never seen anything change the trajectory of a case the way Maverick's presence had changed this one. He said it quietly and without elaboration, and then moved on, because he was a prosecutor and there was always another case. But the people in the room heard it. And Sandra, standing near the back, looked down at Maverick sitting calmly at her feet, and thought about a small voice in a waiting room asking the only question that had ever really mattered. "Are you scared too?" She thought about what Maverick had given Isla that morning. Not courage. Isla had already had courage. She had demonstrated it every single day simply by continuing to exist in a world that had hurt her. What Maverick had given her was something more specific and perhaps more necessary than courage. He had given her company in her fear. And in that company, in that simple and profound refusal to let her be afraid alone, everything else had become possible. The day after the verdict, the courthouse was exactly the same. That was the thing about institutions. They absorbed extraordinary events the way the ocean absorbs stones. There was a momentary disturbance on the surface, a brief disruption of the ordinary pattern, and then the water closed over the place where the stone had entered, and the surface returned to its customary appearance, and the stone settled somewhere on the bottom where it would remain, unseen but permanent, changing the landscape of the floor in ways that the surface would never reflect. The clerks processed their paperwork. The attorneys argued their motions. The security guards waved people through their checkpoints. The coffee cart did its morning business. And somewhere on the third floor, in a small office with a window that looked out over the parking lot and a desk that held a grainy security photograph in a plain wooden frame, Sandra Flores sat down with her first cup of coffee of the day and looked at the photograph for a long time before she opened her emails. She did this every morning now. She had started doing it the week after the hearing, when the photograph had come to her through the courthouse security office, printed on standard copy paper, slightly overexposed, the resolution just soft enough that the details blurred at the edges in a way that made the whole image feel less like documentation and more like memory. A small girl, a big dog, a waiting room floor. Two beings sitting together in the particular quality of stillness that exists when fear has been, at least for a moment, outweighed by something warmer and more sustaining. She kept it in the plain wooden frame because she had decided, deliberately, not to make it precious, not to put it behind glass or place it somewhere prominent or allow it to become a trophy that represented something accomplished. It was not a trophy. It was a reminder. And reminders, in Sandra's experience, worked best when they were ordinary enough to actually look at every day rather than impressive enough to stop seeing. She looked at it now. Then she opened her emails and began the work of the next case. Isla went home to yellow curtains. That was how Maria Garcia described it to Sandra in a phone call 3 weeks after the verdict, not in terms of legal outcomes or case resolutions, or the formal language of the foster care system that had governed so much of Isla's short life, but in terms of curtains. Yellow curtains in a bedroom that was hers. A backyard with a lemon tree that dropped fruit onto the grass and made the whole yard smell like something bright and clean. A kitchen where breakfast happened at the same time every morning and where the radio played and where nobody raised their voice. Isla had been placed permanently with the Garcia family. The process had not been simple or swift. Permanent placement in the foster care system rarely is, moving as it does through layers of evaluation and documentation and legal review that can feel, to the people living inside it, almost deliberately designed to delay the moment when a child finally lands somewhere safe. But Maria and her husband Roberto had wanted Isla from the beginning, had made their intentions known early and clearly, and had navigated the process with the patient determination of people who understood that the bureaucratic distance between wanting to give a child a home and actually giving them one was simply an obstacle to be moved through rather than a reason to give up. The placement was finalized on a Thursday afternoon in December. Maria called Sandra that evening. She didn't say much. She didn't need to. Sandra could hear, in the quality of the silence between Maria's words, everything that the words themselves weren't large enough to contain. Isla's progress in the months that followed was not linear. It never is, with children who have been through what she had been through, and anyone who works in trauma recovery long enough learns to stop expecting it to be. There were good weeks and hard weeks. There were mornings when she woke up bright and curious and mornings when the darkness came back and sat on her chest and made the world feel dangerous again in ways she didn't have the language yet to explain. There were sessions with her new therapist, a gentle, experienced woman named Dr. Carolyn Park, who worked specifically with young children recovering from trauma, and who had a small, ancient tabby cat named Ferdinand who sat in the corner of her office during sessions, and whose presence, Dr. Park had found over years of practice, had an effect on frightened children not entirely unlike the effect Sandra had witnessed in a courthouse waiting room. That went beautifully, and sessions that went nowhere and sessions that went somewhere unexpected and difficult and necessary. But month by month, in the way that healing moves when it is given room and safety and time, not in dramatic revelations, but in the accumulation of small, ordinary moments that gradually outnumber and outweigh the terrible ones, Isla began to come back to herself. She started talking at the breakfast table, not about anything significant at first, about the cartoons she watched in the morning, about the lemon tree in the backyard, about a girl named Sophie at her new preschool who had the same brand of sneakers, and who Isla had decided, with the swift and absolute certainty of a 3-year-old making a social determination, was her best friend. She talked about Ferdinand the cat after her therapy sessions. She talked about what she wanted for her birthday in February, and changed her mind approximately 4 times per week, and each time she changed it, she announced the revision with the complete seriousness of someone issuing an important policy update. She talked about Maverick. Not every day, not with the frequency of something that was still raw, but regularly enough that Maria kept track of it in the little notebook where she recorded Isla's firsts, the first laugh, the first full sentence, the first time she asked for seconds at dinner. The first time Isla talked about Maverick unprompted, Maria wrote it down and underlined it and sat at the kitchen table for a moment afterward with her hand over the page. She called Sandra the next day to tell her. Sandra listened to the whole thing and then said, very quietly, that she was glad. Maverick did not know any of this. He did not know about the verdict or the permanent placement or the yellow curtains or the lemon tree or the little girl who talked about him at breakfast, sometimes in a kitchen in San Bernardino, where the radio played and nobody raised their voice. He did not know about the legal journal article that was published in the spring, or the symposium presentation Sandra gave in Los Angeles, or the 3 other California counties that contacted the Riverside DA's office in the months following the case to inquire about establishing their own facility dog programs. He did not know that his photograph, the grainy, overexposed one from the security camera, had been shared in a professional newsletter read by victim advocates across the state, or that it had prompted conversations in courthouses and advocacy offices and university research departments about what the justice system owed to its most vulnerable participants. He knew none of it. He knew the morning walk from Sandra's car to the courthouse entrance. He knew the elevator and the muffin from the receptionist and the particular smell of the 3rd-floor hallway that told him he was where he was supposed to be. He knew the waiting rooms and the people in them, the particular quality of fear that humans carry in their bodies when they are about to face something enormous, and the way that fear changes when something steady sits down beside it and refuses to be moved. He knew Sandra's hand on his back and the specific cadence of her breathing that told him when she was worried and when she was okay. He knew the work. He knew how to do it, and he showed up every day and did it, not for recognition or outcome or the complex web of human meaning that his presence had generated, but simply because this was what he was and this was what he did, and the doing of it was, in itself, sufficient. It was always sufficient. Sandra Flores would work in victim advocacy for another 14 years after the Isla case. She would work with hundreds of people across those years, witnesses and survivors and frightened children and broken adults, and everyone in between who found themselves inside a system that was powerful and necessary and imperfect, and sometimes, in its imperfection, capable of doing things that felt very close to grace. She would file requests and attend hearings and sit beside people in their worst moments, and do the quiet, unglamorous, essential work of making sure that the most vulnerable people in the room felt, at minimum, less alone. And Maverick would be beside her for 7 more years, until his retirement at 11, when his pace had slowed enough that Sandra made the decision she had been dreading and arranging for in the back of her mind for 2 years. The decision every handler eventually makes, and brought him home to her house in Temecula, where he spent his remaining years sleeping in a patch of afternoon sunlight on the kitchen floor, and taking slow walks through the neighborhood and being, by all observable measures, profoundly content. She kept the photograph on her desk until the day she retired. On that day, she took it down from its plain wooden frame and wrapped it carefully in a piece of soft cloth and put it in the box of things she was taking home. It was the first thing she packed and the last thing she looked at before she closed the box. A small girl, a big dog, a waiting room floor. And between them, in the space that the camera could not quite capture and that no legal document had ever found the language for, something that had been locked for a very long time, opening. He never knew what he had done. He only knew how to show up warm and steady and completely without condition, in rooms where people needed exactly that and had stopped believing they would ever find it. And in the end, that unknowing was perhaps the most extraordinary thing about him. He gave everything he had and asked for nothing in return, not even the knowledge that it had mattered. But it did. It mattered more than any word this story has been able to find.